Boldwood presents Wartime Sweethearts, written by Lizzie Lane and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted.
Chapter 1. It was warm those last few days of August 1939, before the world went to war. The sun shone, and Ruby Sweet was certain she would remember this time for the rest of her life. She couldn't help smiling at the thought of what was about to happen, which had nothing to do with the worsening situation in Europe. People in the village of Oldham Common, just a few miles from the city of Bristol, had been talking for weeks about the possibility of another war with Germany. The wireless broadcasts were going on and on too, and Ruby had got to the stage where she could almost repeat what they were saying word for word. It must be remembered that we are an island nation, and unlike the landmass that is Germany, are unable to feed ourselves. Therefore, should war occur, the enemy will do its utmost to sink our merchant ships. Rationing will come in earlier than in the last war, every crust of bread, every potato grown. Ruby grimaced. How to make a meal from crusts of bread? Potatoes cooked in their skins? For goodness sake. Advice given in a plummy accent about making do with less expensive joints of meat had preceded the broadcast. Consider using braising or even stewing steak instead of a more expensive cut. As if anybody round here can afford anything better than braising or stewing, Ruby muttered. Judging by her twin sister Mary's expression, she was thinking the same thing. The wireless broadcast droned on and on. Ruby was tired of hearing advice about food that didn't form a regular part of most people's diet. Hopefully the war would never happen, and then all this talk would be only so much hot air. The Prime Minister, Mr. Neville Chamberlain. Even now, her brother Charlie and her father, and even her sister, continued to give the radio broadcast their full attention, more specifically to what was happening in Europe, especially Poland. Ruby wasn't interested in Poland. It was too far away, and anyway, she had something else on her mind, something more important to her than a war that might never happen. Still, at least it kept them from noticing that she had dressed up prior to slipping out. While they were engaged, she skipped up the stairs for one last look in her dressing table mirror. She applied a little more lipstick before patting her glossy brown hair, swinging it this way and that, loving the way it fell forward onto her left cheek. Strangers assumed her hairstyle merely aped some of the Hollywood vamps they'd seen at the movies, their silky hair half hiding their sexy smiles. Ruby let them think that. The truth was it hid a small mole on her left cheek. She hated that mole. She wanted it hidden. "Ruby, you look a picture," she murmured to her reflection, admiring the blue and red rose dress she was wearing. This was her favourite dress, and although it made sense to keep it for special occasions, she decided today was special, though only for her, not for anybody else, except for Gareth Stead. Last night, she'd helped out behind the bar of the Apple Tree pub, as she always did when it was busy. They'd exchanged lots of smiles and adoring looks. Gareth sometimes winking at her when he thought nobody else was looking, his hands brushing her hips when he passed behind her, supposedly to change a barrel or fetch a crate of brown ale. She hadn't minded him touching her so intimately because he was always whispering how lovely she was, how he couldn't do without her, how he hoped she would be here forever. His kisses between the time when he shut the pub and she was expected home had been frantic and stolen. She had the touch of his hands upon her breasts and her bottom, furtive at first but becoming bolder when she'd raised no objection. Nobody else had seen. Nobody else knew. Or so she thought. But the night before last, Mary had popped in just before closing time. Charlie had been with her, not that he'd noticed much, straight away taking his pint and joining his friends in a game of darts. Although Ruby helped out in her father's bakery, there weren't enough hours to give her a living wage. Serving behind the bar helped bridge the gap, though her father had insisted that her brother and sister accompany her home. That way there was no wagging tongues, and no chance of Gareth Stead getting his wicked way, or so her father thought. Mary had stayed by the bar sipping at a port and lemon. She had often offered to help Ruby clear up, but her sister had always declined, citing that it was her job and she would do it. The moment they left the pub, she'd commented pointedly that Gareth Stead should learn to keep his hands to himself. "I couldn't help noticing," she said in that disapproving manner she sometimes had. "I know you're sweet on him, but do you think you should be letting him take such liberties?" "We're engaged," Ruby had replied hotly. "Says who? Him in there?" Ruby bridled at her sister's tone. Mary had a cynical streak in her that was completely absent from Ruby's nature. As twins, they were alike in looks and some character traits. Both were strong-willed and stood up for what they wanted. But in other ways, they were as different as it was possible to be. Ruby was convinced that Gareth Stead was in love with her, and that meant marriage. He told her he never wanted her to leave. She felt obliged to convince her sister of his interest. "Are you trying to tell me that he's in love with you?" Mary had demanded. "I think so." Mary had persisted. "You mean he's told you so?" "Not in so many words, Mary." "Not in any words," Mary snapped. "Ruby, stop being such a goose. You know what he wants, and it isn't marriage. Gareth Stead is the sort who wants his cream cake now, and once eaten he'll be fancying a slice of bread pudding. When he's tired of you, he'll move on to pastures new." Ruby congratulated herself that she'd chosen to ignore her advice. She knew better. Gareth loved her, and last night before she'd left, he told her to come to the pub at 11 o'clock this morning. "Not before. There is something boiling between us, Ruby, my love. We can't ignore it any longer." Her blue eyes sparkled at the thought of this meeting. The something boiling was their passion for each other, and he was right. They couldn't ignore it any longer. All night she tossed and turned, pondering what he'd really meant by that, and then it came to her in a flash. "He's going to ask me to marry him," she exclaimed. After that she turned over and fell asleep. This morning the thought had come to her anew. "He's going to propose," she whispered breathlessly to herself, resting a white-gloved hand over her fluttering stomach. "That's what he's going to do." He'd hinted as much at the harvest dance last Saturday evening, after he'd apologised for asking her twin sister Mary to dance, in the belief that he was asking her, Ruby. "Once I was close up to her, I knew it wasn't you. We're made for each other, you and me." Mary would have none of it. "He propositioned me, Ruby. He's that sort." "I don't know what you mean." Mary had given her that piercing look she sometimes had, as though she was years older than her twin sister, and not just a few minutes. "He's not a one-woman man. He likes to think he can have any girl he wants, and plenty of them. He wants me to stay with him forever. He told me he did." "Did he? Are you absolutely sure?" "Yes, he did." Mary had shaken her head dolefully. "Ruby, I just don't see what you see in him. He's been married once already. His wife died. That's what he says. I've heard. She died," Ruby had repeated, barely resisting the urge to cover her ears with her hands. Gareth Stead was 35 years old, 16 years older than she was, and far more interesting than the young men closer to her own age in the village. Gareth was almost as old as her father, but her father still treated her as a child. Despite comments from her sister and friends that the landlord of the apple tree was too smooth and too confident for his own good, she ignored it all. Gareth made her feel special, and she was convinced he felt the same way about her. He'd once said that if she truly loved him, she wouldn't protest when his fingers caressed the bare skin between the tops of her stockings and the legs of her knickers. She didn't even protest when he made overtures to her sister or to the other local women. They all said he was a saucy so-and-so, and he'd assured her there was nothing in any of the rumours she might have heard that he was a Jack the lad, a man who'd had more women than hot dinners. "Sweetheart, it's jealousy. That's all it is, just jealousy." So she ignored the fact that some of those women blushed and lowered their eyes, as though afraid their sparkle might betray the absolute truth. She also ignored the warnings from her sister and her brother Charlie. Charlie was 3 years older than the twins and worked alongside his father in the family bakery. "Be warned. He's a man that won't be tamed. Charlie had said to her. Ruby's smile and the gleam in her eyes had lit up her face. "Nonsense, our Charlie. It's just a case of him finding the right woman." Like her twin, Charlie had shook his head and only smiled. He had a passionate nature just like his sister's, though he couldn't get serious about village girls. He flirted and got to know one or two on an intimate level, but he wasn't serious about anyone, and certainly not Miriam Powell, who ran the grocery shop with her mother and blushed profusely whenever Charlie was in range. Ruby was adamant. The village lads were dull and stupid in comparison with Gareth. She much preferred his worldliness, the way he treated her as a woman, not a child. Ruby believed him utterly and totally. He had stolen her heart. And now her belief in him was about to be rewarded. He was going to ask her to marry him. That's what this secret assignation was about. She was certain of it. When she got to the apple tree, the swing of her hips and her bouncing step was brought to a sudden halt. Someone had left a handcart close to the back door, leaving only the smallest of gaps to squeeze through. Whether she was meeting him or reporting for work, it was always via the back door. Even the fact of having to enter through the front door rather than the back failed to dent her buoyant mood. What did it matter which door she entered by? The outcome would be the same. Gareth would drop to one knee like the brave hero on some old-fashioned painting. He would be her faithful knight forever, and she would be his wife. Gareth came running in response to her gloved fist pounding on the front door. "Ruby," he said in that honey-brown voice of his, a sound that made her stomach flutter and her flesh tingle. No hello or how are you. There was no need. The way he said her name was more than welcoming, as if she were a chocolate pudding and he relished the thought of tasting her. He had the most remarkable green eyes, flecked like the inside of a glass marble, with splashes of amber. She dreamed of those eyes at night. That, and his corn-coloured hair. Mary had told her that she was colour-blind, and that his hair was silver in places. "He's an old ram that thinks he's a spring lamb. Watch out for him," she'd warned, yet again the previous evening. They'd had a row after that, Ruby accusing her sister of being jealous. Their young cousin Frances had been listening, twirling her braid around her fingers, her big blue eyes full of childish curiosity. "Do rams put their hands up girls' skirts?" The sudden question had brought the arguing to an instant halt. They'd looked open-mouthed at 11-year-old Frances, then burst out laughing. Embarrassed by their laughter, Frances's heart-shaped face had turned red before she turned and ran upstairs. They'd heard their bedroom door slam shut, and the sound of springs as she threw herself onto her bed. Neither her sister's serious warning nor her cousin's funny comment could hope to deter her from meeting with Gareth. Just wait and see when she asked them to be bridesmaids. My, but they were going to be surprised. Gareth was dressed in tune with the warm day. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong arms covered with a fine layer of golden hair. A few swirls of chest hair poked up over the open neck of his shirt. "Come along in, my love. Come along in." He made a sweeping movement with his arm. Her heart raced when he stepped to one side, leaving only just enough room so her upper arm brushed against his chest. He smelled of sweat and shaving soap. His striped shirt was spotlessly clean but collarless. She wondered how a man alone could get his shirt so clean, so fresh-smelling. Mrs. Burns, she thought. I expect Mrs. Burns does his laundry. Mrs. Burns, a woman in her 40s with few teeth and a headscarf, cleaned the bar area and the draughty outside toilets. She arrived early and was always gone by 10 in the morning, her metal curlers rattling as she swept and polished, a cigarette hanging from the corner of her mouth. Ruby, who only helped out in the bar of an evening, rarely bumped into her unless Gareth had asked her to work extra hours and her father didn't need her in the bakery. It was on such an occasion that Gareth had first kissed her. Once Mrs. Burns was out of the way, that is. Oblivious to the smell of cigarette ash and stale beer ingrained into the walls and ceiling, she felt herself blushing, stupidly wondering whether the old grey flagstone floor was clean enough for him to kneel on when he proposed to her. Not that she minded if he didn't kneel down. All that mattered was that he was about to ask her. Even though her father's permission had to be sought, she wouldn't refuse. After all, 21 wasn't that far off, and then she could please herself. She looked over her shoulder at him, saw him leaning back against the door, his eyes travelling slowly over her as though savouring every inch. Ruby blinked in an effort to adjust her eyes to the inner gloom. The old pub had walls of burnt sepia, a bar of rough oak, and an odd assortment of beer-stained tables and rickety chairs. Once, she'd laughingly asked Gareth if everyone in the village had donated an odd chair. The rest of the set burned years ago on a bonfire. He'd laughed at that and called her cheeky. That was when he'd first arrived in the village, just 7 years ago. Even back then, when she'd seen him at church or around the village, he'd never really treated her as a child, smiling as he told her what a beauty she was. And he'd never tickled her. Some of the village boys had tickled her, wanting to make her laugh until she was in danger of wetting her knickers. But that was back then, when Gareth and his wife had only just moved to the village. His wife hadn't lasted long. The story was she died of TB just after she was taken to a sanatorium. Ruby only vaguely remembered her. Even back then, Ruby had surmised that Gareth was very aware of her, paying her the same attention as he might an older woman. And that was when I was just a kid, she told herself. Fatherly affection. And now? I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, his voice low and hushed, his fingers tangling in her hair. To her ears it sounded as though he couldn't quite believe she was here. I had to come. You said it was about something special. She couldn't stop her voice from trembling. Her legs were doing pretty much the same thing, and her face felt as though it was about to burst into flames. His smile took her breath away, his gaze holding hers as the gap between them closed until she could feel the whole length of his body pressing against hers. Her heart seemed to pound in her ears, so much that she could almost believe it was the freight train down on the adjacent railway line heading up to the Midlands. But it wasn't a train. This was her moment. It was all about her. When he began unbuttoning the bodice of her dress, it felt as though a small bird was trapped close to her heart, its wings fluttering against her ribs. She held her breath, relishing the feel of his fingers burrowing inside her brassiere. It felt good, and she wanted him badly. But there could be consequences. She would not, could not, bring shame to her family. Gareth, no! She attempted to force his hands away. What if Mrs. Burns comes in? She isn't coming in today, he said, his fingers groping her breast. I wanted for us to be alone. This place and the world to ourselves. Don't you want it too? He asked, his breath hot and moist against her ear, following the line of her jaw, falling over her face until their lips finally met. She so wanted to give in, and yet she still held on to a strand of resistance. He hadn't asked her to marry him yet, but she still believed he would. Besides, it wasn't the first time he'd caressed her bare breasts. He'd also tried shoving his hand up her skirt, just as Frances had mentioned. The little brat must have been watching, though kids picked up all sorts of naughty ideas in the school playground. So far, she'd just about kept the burly Gareth Stead at bay, insisting she was keeping herself for the man she married. Now he was telling her that the time had come, whispering into her ear that he wanted her, and her alone, now and forevermore. She tried to ignore the fact that the word marriage had not been mentioned. To her mind, the words he was whispering into her ear meant the same thing. If she hadn't been aroused, if she'd seen it happening to somebody else, she would have told them they were making a fool of themselves, but it was happening to her, and she wanted to believe. He took hold of her hand, holding it tightly, guiding it down to the front of his trousers. Touch me, he said, his moist breath gasping onto her face. This is what you're doing to me. I can't help it. No, Gareth, I don't... She clenched her hand into a tight fist while trying with all her might to pull away. He held on to her firmly, fingers clamped around her wrist. Here, he exclaimed. Touch me, here. She let out a little gasp as he pressed her palm flat against his button flies, where the hard contours of his erection pulsated against her touch. The size of it was bad enough, but that hardness, it wasn't what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, but it scared her. In her youthful naivety, she'd expected something similar to the sight of her brother and the village boys when they'd stripped naked as youngsters, hurling themselves into the brook at the bottom of Court Road. Gareth didn't seem to notice her reluctance, and she in turn didn't realise just how determined he was to have her there and then. "This is for you," he whispered, his voice thick and breath hot against her face. He planted a warm, moist kiss on her lips, then said, "Unbutton me while I explore your secret parts." She felt a draught of cold air as he lifted the hem of her dress, her favourite dress that she'd taken care to wash and press before responding to his invitation. It occurred to her that he hadn't passed comment on her dress. In fact, he'd paid no compliment to her at all. His hand caressed that part of her leg just above the knee before climbing further and further up her leg. Finally, his strong fingers and calloused palms were caressing the bare flesh between her stocking top and her knickers. It wasn't the first time he'd ventured there, but this time he seemed more determined. Her heart was pounding, her blood racing. She wanted him. He wanted her. But a warning voice began to seep through, and as it gained strength, pointed out the reality of what was happening at this moment. She'd come here expecting Gareth to ask her to marry him, to share his bed for the rest of their lives, but he hadn't mentioned marriage, so it was up to her to bring up the subject before things went any further. "No!" She struggled to free herself, and because he was engrossed in dipping his fingers between her legs, the hand that held hers against his groin loosened. She managed to hold him at arm's length. He looked stunned that she'd refused him. "Ruby, my darling girl, you don't mean that. You want it. You want it badly." He shook his head mournfully, though there was laughter in his eyes. Suddenly she could see that he was mocking her. "I'm saving myself for marriage." "No, Ruby, my sweet. You've been asking for it for years, ever since you were a gangly girl with ribbons in your hair. I thought about giving it to you then, but held back. Decided I'd be a gentleman and let you come of age, ripen, so to speak." Still clinging to her hands, fingers interlaced with his, he tried to kiss her. She acted swiftly, turning her head so he ended up kissing the side of her nose. Ruby uncoupled her fingers from his, pushing him away at the same time as desperately trying to push down her dress. "Nobody says no to me," growled Gareth, his face growing red with anger. He attempted to grab her wrists, cursing that she should feel grateful, a little no-account village girl like her, without grace, without manners, without the elegance or experience of the city women he'd known, including the one he'd been married to. Somehow, he managed to gain a hold on both her wrists. Ruby twisted and wriggled. When that failed, she began to kick, and then suddenly she screamed. Gareth's face turned white. "Shh," he said, putting a finger to his mouth, his eyes more furtive now, wary of her scream being heard. His frustration turned to anger. "If you didn't want it, why the bloody hell did you come here?" he said, glowering at her with chilly hard eyes, the mouth she'd loved to kiss no longer seductive but cruel and petulant. I thought, Ruby stammered. "That's the exit," he said to her, pointing at the rear door that he'd momentarily forgotten was blocked by a handcart. Ruby realised he sounded impatient for her to be gone. Ruby tried again. "I thought—" Hands on hips, Gareth threw back his head and gave his exasperation and his contempt full rein. "Go on! I might as well hear it! What the hell did you think I wanted?" Ruby felt a hot flush coming to her cheeks. Suddenly she was again a little girl, not the sophisticated woman she so wanted to be. She felt such a fool. At first, she thought about just leaving him there without mentioning her belief he had asked her here to propose. But then, if it was left unsaid, he might presume that she had indeed come here for what he'd wanted but had chickened out. She had to say it. "I thought you were going to ask me to marry you," she said in a small voice, eyes lowered as she rapidly buttoned up her dress. For a moment, his expression was implacable, as though his face was carved from stone. He stared at her, a withering stare that made her feel as though she was just a stupid little girl who wanted to play at being a bride. Not for real. Just pretend. He shook his head. Ruby wanted to believe that despite him trying to force himself on her, there might still be hope. She'd imagined herself in a white dress walking down the aisle on her father's arm, Gareth standing at the altar, turning his head and smiling, the light of love in his eyes. The truth of the matter was that even her father had voiced his disquiet that she seemed too close to the man. "Running down there to help behind the bar, cleaning the place when old Mrs. Burns has a day off. The man's taking advantage of you," her father had grumbled just the other day. Gareth Stead, a man with a passion for fresh virgin flesh, prided himself on being able to read female minds, to ingratiate himself with innocent young women until they trusted him. Once they trusted him, they were his to do with as he pleased, and no matter what anyone said, including their family, he was the one they turned to. He had believed that Ruby had fallen under his spell, that she was ready and willing to let him have his way with her. Even though it might have seemed otherwise, Ruby's belief that he would ask her to marry him had come as no surprise. If there was one thing Gareth Stead could do, it was to sow the right seeds in a young mind, entice them with words and actions to make them believe one thing, when in fact he was feeding them lies. That these simple little girls misinterpreted his intentions amused him. The fact that he'd left broken hearts, broken lives, and the odd bastard scattered around didn't worry him. Men ruled this world. Women were the weaker sex. They were there to be enjoyed and kept in their place. He decided to give it one last shot. "We could be good together," he shrugged. "I tried marriage. Don't rate it much. You could move in if you like, but I ain't marrying you. And no babies either. Get pregnant, you get rid of it. There are ways and women who can do it." Shocked by this pronouncement, Ruby raised her eyes. Those amber-flecked green eyes seemed positively devilish now. How often had she dreamed of those eyes? In her dreams, he had been warm and charming, making her feel as though she were a princess. In this last half hour or so, he'd made her feel like something far sleazier. "Don't you ever want children?" "No. I want sex, that's all I want." There was an air of finality to the way he answered. Gareth, Ruby realised, was not a man to be persuaded. He'd made up his mind as to what he wanted from women and from life. She wondered why she hadn't seen that before. The old saying jumped into her mind, "Love is blind." Had she been blind? Was she still blind? She wasn't quite sure. Nobody got over things that quickly. She sucked in her lips, a childish action that would take off her lipstick, but was something she did when she felt chastised, and she certainly felt that now. "Do you need me behind the bar today?" "No." The single-word response was like a slap in the face. "Then I'd better be going." "Yes," he said, turning his back. "You better be going." She paused, seeing him toss a glass cloth over his shoulder as he sauntered to the bar. It was terribly tempting to rush at his back, slide both her arms around him and ask his forgiveness. To say, "Yes, have me now, whatever you want." But a warning voice that came from inside her but wasn't quite hers advised caution. Ruby avoided Gareth's eyes as she listened to the voice inside her head that she knew belonged to her sister. It was a well-known fact that twin sisters were closer than ordinary sisters. Sometimes they thought the same thoughts. Sometimes they did the same things, though miles apart. They were like two sides of the same coin, though not even heads and tails. They were a double-headed coin, something rare and very special. Even though Mary wasn't in the apple tree with her, Ruby could feel her presence, that warning voice telling her not to be stupid. They looked out for each other. They knew when one of them was worried or frightened. "Yes, I think I should go now, and I won't be coming back." She said it abruptly, so he would be in no doubt that she wouldn't change her mind. It seemed that he wouldn't be changing his. "Well, it was fun while it lasted. If you change your mind, I might consider having you back." In between sips of a half-pint of beer he'd poured himself, he smiled the old smile that had seduced her in the first place. She turned her back swiftly and headed for the back door, forgetting that she'd come in the front one. The back door was at the end of a passage connecting the bar to the outside and the draughty old toilets, one for men, one for women. The plain plank doors had a gap at the top and bottom. A zinc bath hung on a nail between the two of them, grating against the uneven brickwork when the wind blew. In the winter the toilets were freezing. A small lamp was left burning in the corner of the wooden rectangular seat. It was meant to help stop the pipes from freezing, but it didn't always work. In the summer, the flies buzzed in and out of the gaps at the top and bottom of the doors. The waste pipes led to a cesspit at the far end of the untidy garden, at the rear. When it rained heavily, the cesspit overflowed and stank. The toilet stank most of the time, despite Mrs. Burns and her trusty bottle of chloris. The handcart was still there, but it was empty now. A sudden bang came from the direction of the pair of wooden doors through which barrels were rolled down into the cellar. Whatever had been delivered on the cart had gone down there. Someone was down there. She managed to squeeze out through the gap. Just as she'd guessed, Gareth had followed her out, thinking perhaps that she might have to come back in and go out the front door. Nothing would make her do that. "See you on Saturday. Hope you win. If you do, I'll help you celebrate." Gareth was referring to the village fete, and sounded as though he was back to his old self, perhaps even thinking it wouldn't be long before he could wear down her resistance. There wasn't much chance of avoiding him at the village fete, but at least it would be crowded. Whether she won or not was a different matter. Competition was fierce, and her greatest rival would be her sister. A dry stone wall separated the pub from the orchard next door. Nobody knew who owned the orchard, so everyone harvested the apples that hung low on the ancient trees. Some of its branches scraped against the side wall of the pub itself. The local kids built dens in there and played cowboys and Indians in the long grass. Everything that was so familiar today seemed tired and ugly. Gareth had made it feel that way. Suddenly, she wanted to leave this place that had been home all her life. She wanted something new and different, far away from the village where gossip was rife and old wounds took a long time to heal. As she passed close to the wall just before it joined the main road, she heard somebody calling her name. "Ruby!" She came to a halt as leaves and ripe apples bounced around her feet. The deluge was followed by her cousin Frances, who was extremely good at climbing trees. Ruby had hoped to get home without seeing anyone, and that included her cousin. "Have you been scrumping?" she asked, though there was little doubt what her cousin had been up to. Still flustered and red-faced from her ordeal with Gareth, Ruby feigned annoyance. "Look at your knees. They're filthy. And you've ripped your dress." "I know." Ruby watched Frances scooping up what rolling apples she could catch, darting around, then tossing them into the sack she was carrying with the others she'd scrumped. "It'll mend easy, though." "Easily. You mean easily," said Ruby impatiently. Frances, the daughter of Sefton Sweet, her father's brother, had lived with them since she was 4 years old, when her mother had left her and a note with the local vicar. Sefton's wife had been determined, so she said, to start a new life. A child, she declared, would only slow her down, and she had no intention of fading into a frump in a village where the high spot of the year was the village fete. And so Frances had come to live with them. Like her 3 cousins, Frances had glossy dark hair. Unlike them, she had velvet brown eyes fringed with dark lashes. Mary, Ruby and Charlie, their brother, had inherited their father's blue eyes. "I thought you'd be pleased," she piped up. "I've got enough of you to make apple turnovers, apple pies, even baked apples with custard for our Sunday tea," she declared. "Our Mary will be happy." "I dare say," Ruby said grimly. She resumed walking, her stride quickening in the vague hope of leaving Frances behind. She was still smarting from her ordeal with Gareth, and couldn't quite believe that all her hopes and dreams of marriage were now over so quickly. Should she have given in to him? No, she should not. Heaving the sack over her shoulder, Frances kept pace with her. "Have you done the cleaning already?" she asked innocently. "I haven't been doing any cleaning. I've been to the post office," snapped Ruby, her jaw firmly set, her cheeks still rosier than any of the apples Frances had in her sack. "So why did you go into the pub?" "I didn't." Yes, you did. I was up in the tree. I saw you. That was after the man with the big sack went into the cellar. I think it was Mr. Herbert. What did he have in his sack?" Ruby stopped so abruptly that the two of them collided. "I don't know what he had in his bloody sack. Were you spying on me?" "Not really. I told you, I was up the tree. I saw you." Ruby gripped her cousin's shoulders and gave her a shake. "You were spying on me. I couldn't help seeing you, or Mr. Herbert." Ruby felt herself growing even redder, alarmed that Frances might have been able to peer through the pub windows from her perch up in the apple tree. She glanced back at the pub. Its 4 brick chimneys stabbed at the sky. Its windows were small and square and set into stone mullions. Those in shadow looked black, nothing of the inside to be seen. Those in sunlight reflected the old wall, the trees, herself and her cousin. All the same, Frances might have seen something. "You're not to tell anyone I was in there this morning. Do you hear me? You didn't see me. Do you understand?" "But—" Ruby eyed the puzzled expression. The child's black eyebrows were arched, her rosebud lips slightly parted. The brown eyes that looked up at her were as glossy as melted chocolate. "No buts. I don't want to hear you speak of this. Did Mr. Stead do something bad?" Ruby frowned. "What do you mean? Did he put his hand up your skirt?" Ruby felt a huge rush of embarrassment. "Frances, you really have to stop going around with that gang of yours. They're filling your head with naughty things." Frances frowned. "They didn't fill my head." Ruby totally disregarded the child's accusation, certainly with relation to Gareth Stead. "Did one of those Cooper boys try to put his hand up your dress?" "No," said Frances, shaking her head and turning away, something she did when she was deciding whether to tell the truth or not. "Not them. He did. Mr. Stead. He climbed over the wall into the orchard with a big sack. He dug a hole and buried it. Then he tried to put his hand up my skirt, but I kicked him and ran away. He told me not to tell." "Liar!" The sound of the slap she gave Frances brought her to her senses. The child was talking about the man she loved, or had thought she loved. She held out her hand, the one that had left a vivid red mark on her cousin's face. "Oh, I'm sorry, Frances. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to—" Frances backed away, her eyes filling with tears, one hand rubbing at the red mark on her cheek. However, Frances was very capable of standing up for herself. Her little jaw firmed up as the hurt expression was replaced by one of anger. "I'm not a liar," she shouted. "Gareth Stead stinks of beer and he buried something in the orchard. I'm not a liar." Ruby felt mortified. She'd never ever slapped her cousin before. Inwardly she groaned. "This is all you're doing, Gareth Stead, and somehow I have to mend what I've broken." She began to run after Frances, but her court shoes had quite high heels and weren't made for running. She called out instead, "Frances, come back! I'm sorry!" Her voice was taken by a sudden breeze, which sent leaves flying and the sound of wind-blown apples landing on the ground on the other side of the orchard wall. Frances kept going, the sack of apples bouncing against her back, her long legs kicking out behind her. Ruby clenched the hand that had slapped her cousin's face. She deeply regretted it, though still couldn't bring herself to believe that Gareth, the man she'd thought to marry, had done such a thing. Frances was just a child, she thought as she headed for home. Children fantasise and like to shock their elders. That was it. That had to be it. Chapter 2. Sweet's Bakery occupied a large corner site at the top of Cowhorn Hill, on the opposite corner to the Three Horseshoes public house, which was run by a widow who was in the envious position of owning both the freehold and brewing her own beer in a shed to the rear of the property. Even so, the Three Horseshoes was in competition with the Apple Tree and a number of other hostelries in the village. There was only one bakery, and Stan Sweet often commented that he preferred to own a bakery rather than a pub. "At least I got no competition," he declared, while slamming down a pile of dough and kneading it this way and that with big meaty hands. Good wholesome loaves were displayed on glass shelves in the shop window at the front of the property. Above the door, the sun glinted on a sign saying S. Sweet and Sons, picked out in gold lettering on a green background. The S in the name referred to Sefton, Stan Sweet's grandfather. There had indeed been 2 sons, but Stan's brother, Sefton, named after his grandfather and father, had died some time back as a result of bad health caused by injuries sustained during the Great War. Behind the shop was the bakery itself, which was dominated by a big black oven with 2 arched doors, the higher one used to bake every loaf of bread they made, closer to the main furnace than the lower one, which was mostly used to make pies, pasties and cakes. Built in Victorian times from locally quarried stones, Sweet's Bakery had been established by Stan Sweet's grandfather back in 1877. The bread had originally been baked in wood-fired ovens, but Stan's father had had the foresight to install a gas-fired oven just after the war. "No more wood-piled roof high out in the yard," he'd announced to Stan and his brother. Stan had given thanks to God that he no longer had to feed the old oven. Turning the tap that let in the gas and putting a match to it was far easier. He didn't even mind the harumph the gas made when he lit it. Anything was better than going outside on a cold, dark, wintry morning, hours before the rest of the village was awake, trundling in and out with fuel and trying to diligently set light to a pile of kindling. Even though the embers from the day before were kept in overnight, if the kindling and the wood was damp, it could take an age to get the oven up and running. Mary glanced up at her sister when she came in. "You look very nice in that dress. You've had it on all day. Special occasion, was it?" "I went for a walk." Mary shook her head and eyed her knowingly. "I don't think so." For a moment, Ruby wished they weren't twins. It was sometimes quite frustrating to have somebody knowing what was in your head or shrewdly guessing what you'd been up to. Ruby bit her lip, folded her arms and leaned against the kitchen sink, looking through the kitchen window, though seeing nothing. Behind her, Mary continued to sort out the apples Frances had brought home. The 2 girls said nothing, each waiting for the other to break the silence. There was an air of anticipation, as though they were playing tennis, and Mary had batted the ball in her sister's direction. Now it was Ruby's turn to bat it back. She had to say something. "I won't be working behind the bar in future," she finally said. Mary nodded and continued sorting the apples before commenting, "So he finally showed his true colours?" Ruby adopted an air of denial. "I don't know what you mean. I just said I won't be working behind the bar in future." Mary wasn't fooled, but hearing pain in Ruby's voice, put the apples and her paring knife down on the scrubbed pine table, stood behind her sister and rested her chin on her shoulder. She looked sideways up into her face, their cheeks touching. "I'm sorry, but I'm glad it's over. You're too good for him." "That's nice to know." Mary's chin dug into Ruby's shoulder. "What's the matter with Frances?" Mary asked. Ruby moved away from the window. "Is something the matter?" Ruby replied, trying not to sound offensive. Despite the fact that she was still wearing her best dress, she began setting up the electric mixer that helped to turn flour, water and yeast into bread dough. Ruby made a big show of shoveling flour into the aluminium bowl of the huge mixer. She had no wish to look at the face that was identical to her own. China blue eyes, dark lashes, finely arched eyebrows. She had no wish to be reminded that her sister's face was blemish-free. "I think you know there is." Ruby was aware that Mary was eyeing her intently, but wouldn't meet her gaze. She had already decided on the walk back that she wouldn't repeat what Frances had said. It couldn't be true. She refused to believe it. "I hadn't noticed there was anything wrong. Where is she?" She hoped she only sounded mildly concerned. "Upstairs, in her bedroom. I heard her door slam. Do you want to help me with these apples? There's half a sack. I thought I'd make apple rings. They should keep well in the outhouse. I've got a sulphur candle and plenty of twigs and string." "And apple chutney?" Mary nodded. "I think so. I'm also considering making apple bread for the baking competition, a nice country loaf, almost a cake. Do you think the judges will like it?" "Not pies?" "I don't think so. Every woman in this village can bake an apple pie. But apple bread, nice moist dough flavoured with a little cinnamon, well, that's something else. Lucky for us we got the bread ovens. What are you going to make?" Ruby shrugged. It had occurred to her to bake an apple pie, but wasn't sure now following Mary's comment. "I don't know. I'm still thinking about it." The fact was that she wasn't thinking about it at all. Still smarting from her treatment at the hands of the man she thought had loved her, it would do no good to say she couldn't possibly concentrate on baking, all because of Gareth's dead. If she said that to her sister, she'd want to know exactly what had gone on. She had already commented about Gareth showing his true colours. There were rarely secrets between them. Mary had guessed, or somebody, Francis perhaps, had told her. Ruby's father spoke to her quietly when she was washing up after a slap-up tea of Victoria sponge, a cream-topped trifle and apple tart generously sprinkled with sugar. He'd come in to help himself to another cuppa, certain his daughter would be alone. It was the first chance he'd had to speak to her about her losing her job at the apple tree, which evidently he'd heard about from her sister. "So no more bar work. Can't say I'm sorry. You're worth better things than that." She nodded. "I'm glad you think so, Dad." She felt his eyes on her and knew it wasn't really the job he was referring to. What he was really saying was that she was worthy of a better man than Gareth's dead. "I know so," he said, patting her shoulder, his voice kind and gentle. "You're a diamond, Ruby sweet. Better than that, you're a ruby," he added with a chuckle. Ruby stopped scrubbing at a sponge tin but didn't meet her father's gaze. Much as she loved him, she didn't want his opinion just now. She didn't want anyone's opinion. "Dad, I know what you're saying. I know you don't like Gareth." She glanced at him. He wasn't quick enough to hide an expression of outright distaste. In Stan's opinion, there was no point in beating about the bush, so he didn't. "He's second-hand, Ruby. He's too old for you, and he's been married before." "He's a widower. Not all widowers are unworthy." She fancied her father winced. He himself was a widower. "That may be," he said slowly. "All the same, I think you can do better." Monday morning, and the smell of freshly made bread was warm and inviting. Each time the door opened, the smell seeped out into the street. It rose with the steam from the chimney serving the bread oven. Anyone passing had no real need to read the sign above the door of the shop. All they had to do was follow the delicious aroma that enveloped the bakery like a scented veil. Seeing as Ruby no longer had her few hours' work at the pub, there was nothing for it but to do some housework, get the laundry on the go and help Mary in the shop, though only if needed. For the moment she wanted to be alone, to lick her wounds and not have anybody feel sorry for her. Francis had gone to school, and their father was putting in bread and setting timers for each batch of loaves. Ruby took Mary a cup of tea and brought one for herself, placing everything on a tray, including some coconut biscuits she'd made the day before. Mary thanked her. Ruby pretended she didn't hear, but Mary called to her before she could retreat into the family's living accommodation at the rear of the shop and to the side of the baking room. "Ruby, I have something I need to talk to you about." "I expect you do," snapped Ruby, assuming that Mary would challenge her about Gareth. Mary had no intention of doing so. There wasn't really enough work in the bakery for the two of them, and Mary had intended voicing the subject when the door leading to the shop suddenly burst open. Their brother Charlie bolted in, looking as though the hounds of hell were after him. "Hide me!" The twins exchanged wry glances. Despite herself, Ruby had to smile. Mary barred his way to the back of the shop. "Miriam?" Their agitated brother nodded. He looked pink-cheeked, and it wasn't from tending the ovens. Miriam was after him. "Can one of you go serve her and tell her that I've been requisitioned by the Army or Navy, or even kidnapped by Hitler?" he pleaded. "I've got apples to peel." Ruby looked tellingly at her sister and giggled. "Your turn." Mary pulled a face and sighed. "I'll deal with her," she said grimly. Miriam Powell had a freckled face and reddish hair. 28 years old, she was a spinster who up until fairly recently had spent her time caring for her elderly parents. While her father had been alive, she wasn't allowed to even be alone with a man. For fear the closeness of a masculine thigh heats her blood to the point of no return, her father had sermonised. Her father, Godfrey Powell, had been a lay preacher who used to run the grocery shop, a place of piled-up tins, a bacon slicer, and a truckle of cheddar cheese, ripe, pungent, and bright yellow. Poor Miriam. During her father's lifetime, he had resolutely kept his daughter indoors, never allowing her out unaccompanied. Following his death, she now had more freedom than she used to have. Her mother was not nearly so demanding, mainly because it was not in her nature to order anyone around. All her life she'd been ordered around by others, including her husband. Her one sticking point was insisting that Miriam accompany her to church 3 times during the week and twice on Sundays. They made a meagre living in their shop, Miriam's father having died owing money that they were still trying to repay. There wasn't any extra money for clothes, and they were known to live mostly on the vegetables left on the dusty shelves at the end of the week. Despite the church-going, Miriam was beginning to enjoy herself. She'd also discovered she very much liked the opposite sex, especially Charlie Sweet. Judging by the way she looked into Charlie's eyes while buying a split tin and a cottage loaf, she was his for the taking, except that Charlie didn't reciprocate her affection. He'd tried telling her this, pushing her away when she came at him with her lips pursed and her big coat undone. Even at the village dance, where she was only allowed to stay until 8 o'clock, she still wore her big coat. Undaunted, or perhaps unaware of Charlie's rejection, she came in 3 days a week, her order always the same, 1 large split tin loaf and a cottage loaf. "I think she must be feeding every sparrow in Old Land Common," Mary had commented. Ruby grinned. Her sister could be funny as well as deadly serious. She also knew how to dress, the shade she chose always suiting her colouring. Today she was wearing a bright blue dress under her apron, the colours accentuating her eyes. "Perhaps it's all her and her mother live on." Mary made a disbelieving sound. "Sandwiches every day? I don't believe it. You can't tell me that just her and her mother are eating all that bread. I don't believe it." Miriam came dashing in just moments after their brother, bringing a breeze and the first of the autumn leaves with her. She was wearing her usual checked coat that, despite the breeze, looked far too warm for the weather they were currently having. It was the one she always wore, winter, summer, spring or autumn. Her face was pink, not because she was hot, but because it was the normal colour of her complexion. The sprinkling of freckles helped tone down the colour, but all in all it could be said that Miriam had a busy face. "Is Charlie not working in the shop today?" Her expression was one of enduring hopefulness, her voice lilting up and down in a sing-song way. Not surprisingly, she was a member of several church choirs and was known to sing a very good solo rendering of Abide With Me. Mary took on an apologetic look and primed her voice to match. "I'm afraid not, Miss Powell. Our father had to visit the yeast merchant, which means that Charlie has to tend the oven, then get the dough ready for the morning." Miriam's face sagged. "My word, but it's hard work running a bakery. You and your family are on the go all the time. I don't think I could do it. I never was very good at getting up in the morning. You should be up with a lark, my father used to tell me. I was always up by 7, but never with the lark." Mary smiled sweetly. "It wouldn't do for you to marry a baker then, would it, Miss Powell?" Miriam's face fell even further. "Oh, I never thought of that." Her look of dejection was short-lived. "I suppose marrying a baker would be the opportunity I need to change my ways," she said, her face alight with hope. "And of course, if one has a family, families all help each other, don't they?" Mary agreed with her, and although she smiled, she stopped it from spreading too wide or she might burst out laughing. She had no wish to hurt Miriam, but she just couldn't see her brother, Charlie, and Miriam together, not to mention the red-headed children the 2 of them might produce. Mary wrapped up Miriam's order in brown paper and took the money. Once she'd gone, she locked the door, turned over the sign saying open to closed, and pulled down the biscuit-coloured blinds. Charlie came through the door between the shop and the place where the bread oven hummed with heat. He was swigging back a cup of tea. "That woman gives me the willies. I wish she'd stop pestering me." "That woman is in love with you," said Ruby, flipping at her brother's head with the corner of a tea towel. "Not my type. I don't go for redheads. Never have." Ruby sliced the last apple into the saucepan and added the sugar. "So what is your assault?" she asked, an amused smile flickering around her lips. Charlie threw back his dark head and closed his eyes that were identical to those of his sisters. "Now let me see." His brow was deeply furrowed. "I know what I'd like. I'd like one of them South Sea Island girls. Dark hair, dark eyes, and wearing a grass skirt and flowers in her hair." "Ha!" said Mary. "I have it on good authority that she'll be at the fete tomorrow. You won't be able to avoid her." "A hula girl?" he asked hopefully. "No," Ruby added with a grimace. "Miriam. She'll be there." The look of hopefulness fled his face. "In that case, I'll hide myself in the beer tent. Even though her old dad's dead, she still won't go in there, the demon drink and all that." "Charlie, sweet, are you telling me that you're only going to the village fete for the beer?" Ruby couldn't help chuckling. "It's me day off, a holiday, of sorts." "You're not entering anything?" Mary asked him, eyeing her beloved brother sidelong, noting the impish grin and the way he ran his finger over his top lip. He grinned. "How about a rich pudding soaked in ale, loads of sultanas and candy peel?" "Are you serious?" Mary said to him. "No," said Ruby. "He's just being stupid." The girls had entered the village fete baking competition every year since the first time they'd mixed their own bread dough. But for Charlie, baking was work, not pleasure. Baking for the village fete he would leave to his sisters. Besides, it took up valuable drinking time. Still, their father had encouraged all of the children to have a go as early as they could sprinkle flour through their fingers. He'd laughed those first few times they'd baked their own bread, made pies or pasties and cakes. Not at their efforts, which he praised to the roof, telling all three of them, Charlie included, that they were chips off the old block and he was proud of them. "Thing is, you're wearing as much flour as you're putting in the bowl." His laughter and obvious pleasure was accompanied by him dabbing more flour on all their noses. Not that it made much difference, seeing as their faces were already covered in it. Frances came back from school at lunchtime, darting through the back kitchen and up the stairs. Asked Charlie, as a cloud of flour floated down from the ceiling when Frances banged their bedroom door. No matter how careful they were, flour got everywhere. "She's of an age," said Mary. Charlie looked puzzled. "An age? What age?" Mary shook her head and reached for the rolling pin. "Never mind, Charlie. Let's just say it's women's trouble." "Women's?" he said incredulously. To him, Frances was just a nipper. Suddenly he realised she meant the monthly business and turned beetroot red. "I'll just pop up to see if she's all right," said Ruby, taking off her white apron and hanging it on the hook on the back of the door. She headed for the stairs, closing the door tightly behind her. "What's up with Ruby?" asked Charlie once they could hear her footsteps overhead. "Same thing?" "Not quite. I'm surprised you noticed." He shoved his hands in his pockets, swaying backwards and forwards, mainly because he wished the subject of women's trouble hadn't come up. The women outnumbered the men in this house, which sometimes made him feel something of an outsider. He might find women fascinating, but they were also a little frightening. "Of course I noticed. Why shouldn't I notice? So what's up with her?" The contents of the saucepan containing apples chose that moment to reach boiling point. Mary turned it off. "Well," she said, her attention focused on the apple slices, "you may have noticed that she went out on Sunday morning all dressed up and looking as though the world belonged to her and her alone. She returned looking as though she'd lost it somewhere." "Where'd she been?" "For a walk, so she said." "You don't think so?" Mary set the saucepan on the window ledge to cool. "She went to the apple tree. I knew by the look in her eyes that she hadn't been for a walk. She looked desperately unhappy, and I didn't need her to tell me the reason why. I could guess. She thought Gareth loved her." "I see." Charlie nodded into his teacup. "So that's why she's dumped her job pulling pints. I take it he let her down." "Of course he let her down." "I hoped it'd wear off, otherwise—" Charlie pulled a face. "I was going to say that I'd have a word with the bloke, but then, what good would that have done? She had to find it out for herself." Mary agreed with him. "Thank goodness she has. Now perhaps she'll forget the man." Charlie set down his teacup and clenched his fists. I suppose I could still go along and have a word with him. Keep away or else. I don't think you need to, unless he starts pestering her, but I don't think he will. He'll move on to easier girls. She knew he was suggesting that he warn Gareth Stead to keep away from his sister. It was the or else that worried her. If you're sure. Mary set a pan of milk onto the gas ring, let it heat up, then added custard powder and sugar. Leave it, Charlie. Let sleeping dogs lie. In time she'll forget him and find someone else. Charlie took another sip of his tea as he considered the rumours he'd heard regarding Gareth Stead. The man was a lecher, preferring younger women to those his own age. One girl in the village, Kathy Page, was only 16 when her family sent her away to live in the city. Rumour had it that her staying away was necessary until the baby she was expecting had been born and instantly put up for adoption. Even then, Kathy didn't come back. A ruined reputation was easier to hide in a big city with a large population than it was in a village, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Ruby was lucky, even though she didn't know it yet. Chapter 3. Frances was lying face down on the bed, one arm thrown over her head, the other beside her cheek. I want a word with you, Ruby said, closing the door firmly behind her. Frances said nothing and didn't move. Her hair was loose from its usual braids and hid her face. It looked as though she was sucking her thumb. Have you been spying on me, telling Mary everything that's been going on? Although her tone was confrontational, she was careful to keep her voice down. The last thing she wanted was for her sister and brother to hear, but it was hard not to shout when she was feeling so angry. Frances raised herself on one arm and looked over her shoulder. I didn't tell Mary anything. She just seemed to know that you and Mr. Stead weren't friends anymore. She said it was for the best. So did Charlie. What's a lecher? Ruby's jaw dropped. What? Who told you that word? Charlie. He said that Mr. Stead is a lecher and that he wouldn't leave a bitch in his company for long. I know what a bitch is. It's a female dog. That's disgusting. Frances frowned. Growing up, she decided, wasn't easy. There was so much to learn. So many things she could do when she was younger that she couldn't do now. Like Mary telling her that she was too old to tuck her dress into her knickers so she could climb trees more easily.